Welcome back. We know all about axis mappings now, but when we created our axis mappings, there was another type of input mapping called an action mapping there in the project settings, and we don't know how those work yet. So let's talk about those. Action mappings are a lot like axis mappings. They're pretty similar, but there is a key difference. So just like axis mappings, action mappings have a name. We can specify that in the project settings. So we could create an action mapping called jump, for example. And just like axis mappings, we can assign keys or other types of input to the action mapping. Now here's where axis mappings and action mappings differ. We know that axis mappings are kind of like the tick function. They're executed every frame. Action mappings are not. With an action mapping, we have a one-off type event. Let's say we take some function and bind it to our action mapping. Now, the character class has the function called jump built right into it. And since /character is derived from character, it has access to that function. So we can bind this function to our jump action mapping if we want to. In fact, if the spacebar is linked to our jump action mapping, our callback function jump will only be called if the spacebar gets pressed, and it'll be called one time. So as soon as we press the key, the callback function executes. So in a way, action mappings are a lot more efficient than axis mappings. And if we don't need something happening every single frame, then an action mapping is the way to go. These are great for one-off actions like jumping, attacking, picking up an item, throwing rocks, things like that. So we're going to set up an action mapping. Now, just like axis mappings, we set up our action mappings in project settings. So we'll go to Edit, Project Settings, and scroll down to Input. Now, under bindings, we see that we already have some axis mappings. But action mappings is empty. There's no drop-down here. But there will be as soon as we click the plus icon. Now that we have that drop-down, we can expand it and see our newly created action mapping, which we can give a name. We're going to call it jump. And just like axis mappings, we assign keys. I'm going to use the spacebar. So I'm going to click the keyboard icon, hit the spacebar on my keyboard, and now spacebar is linked to the jump action mapping. And that's it. We now have a jump action mapping. And just like our axis mappings, as soon as we created that, there now exists a jump axis event we can access from the character blueprint. So if I open /character, I can right-click and type jump, and now we have an action event called jump. So let's click that and check this out. We have jump, and we have the ability to execute logic when the associated key or keys are pressed versus released. And we even have an output of type key structure. Now, when the jump key is pressed, we can do something. I'm going to type jump again, and notice there's a function called jump. It says at the very bottom of this long comment that target is character. Now that tells us that this is a function on the character class, which we have access to because we are a character after all. /character is derived from it. So if we click jump, we're calling the jump function. So let's go ahead and hit play and hit the space key. And we're jumping. Our character is stiff. There's no jump animation playing because, well, we haven't set up anything in the animation blueprint. But we are jumping. So it's a start. But we want to do this from C++. So let's go ahead and delete those nodes and hop back into Visual Studio. Now, in order to bind a function, we need to go into /character into setup player input component. Now, binding an action is very similar to binding an axis. We simply take the player input component and call bind action. Now, bind action takes an F name for the action mapping name. That's going to be an F name, and we're going to use the jump action mapping. Now here's where binding an action differs from binding the axis. Binding an action requires us to specify if we want our callback function called in response to the key being pressed or released. And there's an enum that has the enum constant, i.e. pressed, and the enum is called eInput event. So the second input is that enum specifying whether we want this function called when it's pressed or released. And if we wanted it called when released, we would use IE released instead, but we want pressed. Now next is the user class object, and that's going to be this, just like it was for binding axes. Now we could create a function and put its address here, just like we did with the axis mappings. But the jump function already exists, as we've already seen. We just called it in Blueprints, and it belongs to the character class. So we can specify that function. We can use the address of operator and use a character jump. Now be careful here. We're using a character jump. Don't try to use a /character jump, because a /character jump is not a thing. We haven't overridden the jump function here, so we're just calling the function that actually exists on the character class. This is legal. We can do this. And later on down the line, if we want our own custom jump function here in this class, we can make it and change this to use that function. But for now, we're going to use a character jump. So now that we've bound a callback function to the jump action mapping, we can save everything, and back in the editor, we can hot reload. And once we're done, we can press play, and once again, we can jump. And I jumped right off the edge. So we're stiff. We don't get a jump animation. If we're running, we stay running in the air. And if we stop running, well, then we just jump really stiff like that. So that's not good. We're going to take care of that. We're going to do that in the next video so we won't have stiff jumping. I'll see you soon.